Greetings all. This is 15 minutes or less with the professor. I am your host, Professor Keys, and the topic today is to every condition there's a cause. In tribute to the late great legendary boxing referee Mills Lane, let's get it on. Malcolm X once said, quote, "Conditions don't pop up out of the sky. To every condition there's a cause," unquote. What is significant about this is that the reaction of the state apparatus in the United States to problems that members of the society incur is to attempt to remove blame from the system for those problems by placing the blame on the individual. In sociology, this is called blaming the victim. And the contradiction is that the victim is exhibiting a condition that has been caused by the system. For instance, racism is systemic in the United States, which means that whenever a member of the society exhibits racist practices, whether white, black, or other, it is imprudent to assume that individual is responsible for the existence of systemic racism. Instead of the opposite, the system is responsible for the racist behavior of the individual. Another example is, as I mentioned in a previous video, that we live under more than 20 different systems of oppression, and there are pathological behaviors that the members of society practice as a result of adopting the values of those different systems of oppression. No individual is responsible for the existence of the multiple systems of oppression. Nevertheless, the state apparatus insists that the individual is responsible for his choices and actions. There is some merit to this assertion, and this leads us to the accountability challenge, which was also mentioned in a previous video. The accountability challenge is taken whenever a problem arises and we want to examine whether or not ego defense mechanisms are the root cause of the problem. The accountability challenge consists of two questions we must ask and answer correctly. The first is, how has the system contributed to the problem? And I advise everybody to challenge all information presented to them, including information from me. However, you can trust and believe me when I tell you that whenever there's a problem, the system will always contribute to it. The second question is, how have I, the individual, contributed to the problem? Whenever an individual has a problem, you can trust and believe me when I tell you that the individual will always contribute to the problem. And for that reason, it is of paramount importance for the individual to ask that second question in the accountability challenge. How have I, the individual, contributed to the problem? Otherwise, the individual will be exhibiting ego defense mechanisms by blaming everything on the system and not taking any accountability. In summary, whenever individuals have problems of any kind, you can rest assured the system and the individual make contributions to them. At this time, I want to acknowledge Lauryn Hill for her contribution to the development of the concept of the accountability challenge. During her MTV performance of her second solo album, she was sharing the problems she had recently experienced, and she was having a conversation with God. She said God would say to her, "Lauryn, honey, this is the problem, and this is how you are contributing to the problem." I took that concept and converted it to the concept I use in the accountability challenge. Initially, I only asked one question: how have I, the individual, contributed to the problem? However, as a professor of sociology, which is essentially behavior science from a systemic analysis, it was inevitable that I would add another question to the accountability challenge, and the additional question became the first question in the process. How has the system contributed to the problem? It is nothing new for the individual to be expected to take accountability for their contribution to problems, but apparently it is something new to expect the system to take accountability for its contributions. It is way past time for that to change. In reality, the call for the system to take accountability for its contributions to problems individuals incur is not something new, but has been around for a very long time. Moreover, the full context of the Malcolm X quote that I began this video with is as follows, and was made in the 1960s. Malcolm is describing how the state apparatus attempts to deceitfully remove blame from the system onto the individual. Malcolm said, quote, "The approach that was used by the administration right on up until today, to even the present generation, was designed skillfully to make it appear that they were trying to solve the problem when they actually weren't. They would deal with the condition, but never the cause," unquote. Malcolm pinpointed the hypocrisy of the state apparatus because any sincere effort to solve any problem involves observing the condition, then investigating to find its cause. The state apparatus tries to keep the focus on the condition and move forward from there because they know if there were an investigation into the cause, it would implicate the system. A recent example to explain this phenomenon is the actions of the Zionists to use the bombings and taking of hostages by Hamas on October 7, 2023, which is the condition, and used that to justify their reaction of genocide in Gaza. They ignore the cause of Hamas's actions, which consists of a long history of violent oppression by the Zionists involving numerous atrocities that date back to the 1920s. Dr. Kwame Ture, a contemporary of Malcolm X's, explains the concept of dealing with the condition and ignoring the cause by identifying the system of capitalism as the oppressor and the cause. He offered the following assertion as early as the 1960s. He said, quote, "Anytime you make an analysis of an oppressed people in any aspect of their lives and you leave out the enemy, you will never come to a correct analysis. On the contrary, you will blame the oppressed for all of their problems. Therefore, we tell you from the very beginning, we've never taken a line of others that the biggest problem we have is we ourselves. No, our biggest problem is our enemy, capitalism, and it must be destroyed. We say any analysis you make of an oppressed people must include the oppressor. Otherwise, you will come up with an incorrect analysis, blaming the oppressed for their position of oppression," unquote. Approximately a decade later, Dr. Amos Wilson described this phenomenon regarding ignoring causes and focusing only on conditions by referring to the role of the system as the social context. Discussing the conditions and causes of criminal behavior, he said, quote, "If you ignore the social context, then you will get engaged in blaming the victim and seeing certain people as innately criminal. And of course, this is what this society would like for us to do, so that we can engage in self-blame and not deal with the system itself and the contributions it makes. It wants us to engage in this kind of thinking so that we can no longer perceive those that lead this society as the true criminals and to deceive us into believing that this society itself is not criminogenic. That is, it is not the source of crime," unquote. Just as the accountability challenge asks the two questions, how has the system contributed to the problem, and how have I, the individual, contributed to the problem? To counter divide and conquer tactics, it would be best if we use the accountability challenge when considering the problematic actions of others. In other words, when an individual takes the accountability challenge, they are self-reflecting, which means they are examining the causes of their behavior. We should also consider the two questions in the accountability challenge when examining the causes of the problems committed by others. It will look like this. How has the system contributed to their problem, and how have they contributed to the problem? Too often, we fail to ask, how has the system contributed to the problems of others, and instead we condemn them by being judgmental. Recently, I watched a video where the person was claiming that people are disloyal, untrustworthy, conniving, backstabbers, etc. The person was describing conditions that people exhibit, and they were all true. However, that person did not acknowledge any causes to those conditions. According to Dr. Kwame Ture, quote, any analysis you make of an oppressed people must include the oppressor. Otherwise, you will come up with an incorrect analysis blaming the oppressed for their position of oppression, unquote. According to Dr. Amos Wilson, quote, if you ignore the social context, then you will get engaged in blaming the victim. And of course, this is what this society would like for us to do so that we can engage in self-blame and not deal with the system itself and the contributions it makes, unquote. Next, I will read the observations from a written assignment of one of my students and the feedback I gave that deals with this issue of identifying the system as the cause of conditions. Your statement regarding your annoyance with excessive coverage of anti-whiteness, quote, I have been feeling this way since the start of class, and I do not want to make you feel bad because it is not your fault, unquote, is a compliment when you consider the following statement from Bree Purkower's book, Reading, Writing, and Racism, Disrupting Whiteness in Teacher Education and in the Classroom. Quote, for schools to be places of liberation, teachers will have to tell the whole picture about the history of racism, unquote. Regarding your statement, quote, I understand that a lot of white people are a cause of a lot of problems for a lot of people, and I understand the anger, but the alienation is really annoying sometimes, unquote. I refer you to the following excerpt from Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. She is describing what white fragility means. Quote, socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. These include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility, unquote. Concerning your statement, quote, in the colorism video you showed today, there was a line that went something along the lines of, if you think you are not exhibiting racist, colorist qualities and are light-skinned, you are wrong. And that is such a massive overgeneralization, unquote. I agree it is a generalization. However, the title of the video is Afro-Latinx Experts Talk About Racism Within Our Community, which means they were talking about Latinos exclusively. The reason why it is a generalization is that some white Latinos unlearn the anti-blackness, racist values they learned from the structural systemic racism that is the cause of the condition of racism every white Latino learns. It is not an unrealistic generalization due to the structural and systemic racist values that are pervasive in the Latino community. The full context of his statement is as follows, quote, assume that you engage in anti-black practices because you do. The question isn't if you do, but how you do, because anti-blackness is woven into our cultures and is perpetuated in our everyday lives. Work to recognize, deconstruct, and unlearn those habits, unquote. If you recall, the last statement in the video made the point that changing the structure or system is the only real solution. Quote, if we don't uproot things with love